Welcome back, and thank you to all my subscribers. Okay, we getting back in our book, The New World Order, because I got to get to some serious stuff. The right of association. This is chapter 30. All right, shoot, I need a better lighting. Okay. One of the cornerstones of freedom is the right to negotiate a contract with another individual or a group of individuals. The free man or woman has the right to decide who they will enter into a contract with. It follows, therefore, that no man has the right to force another into a contract that the individual does not freely want to enter into. Forcing one individual into a contract that individual did not freely enter into is called slavery or involuntary slavery. Like going to a job every day, 9 to 5, that's involuntary slavery. There was a book I read in the 90s called, it was by a black woman too, called Involuntary Slavery. That's working a 9 to 5, and that's a fact. Allowing the government to choose an individual's association and forcing them to join together, it is also wrong and another form of involuntary servitude or slavery. All men and women have the right to protect themselves from the coercive force of other individuals or groups. Men and women join together to form governments to protect the rights from the aggressive and the coercive activities of others. One of the functions of government is to protect people from contracts that they were not freely entered into. These contracts are to be declared null and void and are to have no legal force or effort. One of the basic purposes of the New World Order is to restrict the right of the individual to be free from force of another. These definitions of slavery and involuntary servitude are currently being challenged by those who wish to enslave mankind. That is a fact. Examples of how slavery is becoming fashionable are appearing in every segment of society, and courts are making slavery the law of the land. You ain't never lied. You ain't never lied. These is some rogue judges that I have never seen. They being paid by George Soros, the number top head of the Illuminati for the destruction of America. These DAs, they all getting George Soros funding. Black Lives Matter, Planned Parenthood, all of that's for the destruction of America, and it is happening. Okay, where was I at? Shit. Oh, a legal contract is defined as one in which two or more parties agree to certain terms in order to reach mutually acceptable goals. If one party is forced into any contract against his or her will, the contract is, de- is declared to be null and void and therefore unenforceable. As was discussed, one of the functions of the courts of the United States is to enforce valid contracts between two consenting individuals. Once an individual enters into a contract, the other party has the right to have the terms of the contract met, even if the first party decides later not to perform as required. But today's courts are enforcing contracts where one party was forced into the terms of the contract, or in other cases, where one party did not agree to the terms. In those cases, the courts have chosen to force that party to abide by the terms of the contract that they were unwilling to make. That is a fact. This is simply called slavery. A good case in point was the Supreme Court ruling in 1987 where they forced the Rotary Club, a group of men, voluntarily joined together for friendship and acts of charity to accept women as members. The article reported the Supreme Court toppling another sex barrier, declared yesterday that the state's civil rights laws may force Rotary International and similar all-men private clubs within the state to admit women to members. Now, what woman would want to enter into an all-men's club when they don't want you? You're gonna enter into a hostile environment. That's dumb. By a vote of 7-0, the justice concluded that a California anti-discrimination statute, should have known it was California, requiring women to be admitted to Rotary clubs within the state does not violate the right of members to choose their own association. A review of the comments of the Supreme Court revealed exactly how words have lost their meaning and are to mean exactly what the court says they mean. First of all, the court agreed that these clubs were private. That meant that members were not publicly invited others into the organization. They were exercising their right to associate with whomever they choose to associate with. These men, acting as free individuals, were choosing to associate in a voluntary manner with only those people they wish to associate with. This is the right of free men. The court was forcing them into a contract with people that they freely chose not to associate with. After the court decision, one can only wonder what would have happened if the Rotary clubs decided to disband because they wished to only associate with men. Would the court have forced them to continue their meetings? And then what would have happened if no one chose to attend? Would the court have jailed the missing members? How could they have known whether a person's failure to attend was the result of a legitimate illness or because he chose not to attend? Would the court have forced him to provide a doctor's excuse to explain his absence? The court said that this use of court ordered force did not violate the right of members to choose their own associates. The court admitted that the men had this right and then ruled they didn't have this right. This is double talk of the highest order. Freedom does not mean that certain people are free to force other people into associations that the first have deemed advisable. Simply stated, free men discriminate. Slaves do not. Damn. Free men discriminate. Slaves do not. Free men have a right to choose their own associations. Slaves do not. Damn. Therefore, when the court ruled that the Rotary clubs had not chosen correctly and forced them to associate with individuals that they had freely chosen not to associate with, the men in the clubs were no longer free to choose their own associates. The court had decided that slavery was preferable to freedom. In another violation of free man's right of association, the U.S. Justice Department filed suit against a Christian conference center, claiming that it violated federal civil rights laws when it prohibited the Mormons from using the facilities to expose their own teachings. If one individual has the right to associate with whomever that individual chooses to associate with, a group of individuals also has that same right. In this case, the discrimination charges were levied by a Mormon group that was denied permission to rent the facilities to hold their own conference and teach Mormon religious beliefs. The director of the center stated that he had turned them down because the Mormon view of Christianity differs markedly from the beliefs of the owners of the center. Should a court determine that the inn is a public accommodation on the basis of offering meals and overnight lodging, the decision could signal increased governmental control over other religious conferences facilities for that matter, any public facility. Hmm. Should a hotel be allowed to refuse the rental of a room or a group advocating the violent overthrow of the government? Should a hotel be allowed to not rent to a group advocating violent animal sacrifice if they determine that when the group asks for facilities for the purpose of conducting their religious rites, Just where does the right of one group to practice their religion and where does the right of the hotel to rent to anyone they choose to begin with? In another case, the Minnesota Court of Appeals also ruled against the right of free association. In 1986, they upheld a $300 a day fine levied against a chain of health clubs for failing to bring a halt to employment practices involving religious discrimination. The owners of the health club agreed that they could not comply with the order to cease discrimination against non Christians because they felt that they had the right to employ only those who agreed with their own religious views. In other words, they believed that they had the right to employ only fellow Christians if they had freely chosen to do so. The court ruled that they were wrong. And even in an organization as all American as the Boy Scouts of America does not have the right to freely choose their association. In 1983, the Second District Court of Appeals decided that the Boy Scouts did not have the right to refuse membership to those young people who were homosexual. It is not a strength of this logic to imagine that the courts will soon decide that a church does not have the right to reject the application for church membership of an admitted atheist. This would be religious discrimination. But to further confound the problem, it appears that this nation's courts do not have a clear, definite policy about discrimination. They sure don't. In 1987, a state court of appeals ruled that boys could be barred from playing on high school girls' teams to prevent them from dominating the game and displacing the girls. Damn, so the right, so this was boys, so then now we dealing with trans women in girls' sports. They've been pushing this for 40 years. Damn, wow. So the result of these and similar decisions is to clearly say to the world, you will discriminate when ordered to do so, but you may not freely choose to associate. The courts have now made it mandatory that you can freely associate only with whomever they decide that you can freely associate with. And if you do not choose to freely associate with someone they wish you to freely associate with, the courts will force you to freely associate with that person. This is simply called court ordered slavery. Obviously, slavery is no longer slavery, and freedom is no longer freedom. Furthermore, if the above cited examples were not enough, even certain senators in the United States Senate have admitted they no longer know what the two words mean. In April 1989, Senator John McCain he introduced a Senate Bill 781, a bill called the National Service Act of 1989. Bill 781 reversed those number 187 murder. Wow. This bill calls for the administration to develop a comprehensive mandatory national service program. The center offers the curious public a brief explanation of his bill. This legislation will establish a program leading to a comprehensive, fair, and mandatory system of community or military service to the nation. Wow. The bill stipulates that both men and women between 16 and 26 will be required to serve either in the community or in the military. They will serve 24 hours a month and 2 weeks during the year for 2 to 4 years. The senator's news release stated that this bill would be fair. Somehow, forcing someone to serve the nation is now deemed to be fair. Slavery used to be defined as forcing one individual to serve another. Slavery used to be called madness. Now it's being called fair. But that is what Senator says in his news release. The news release further said this program will allow us to combine the responsibility of citizenship with a concert effort that addresses vital community and national defense needs that otherwise will be unmet in years ahead. So, mandatory service to the government has now become a responsibility of citizenship. Man was created to be free. Man was not created to be a slave of the government. In fact, government was created by man to be the servant of mankind. Facts. And here it's certainly switched around. Man was not to be the servant of government. America used to be called the land of the free and the home of the brave. Now one would be mandatorily obligated to serve the nation. This is the new requirement of citizenship. Freedom is not mandatory service. To show that there is bipartisan support of this bill of fairness, Arizona Senator Dennis Dominci, a Democrat, also publicly announced support of this idea. Senator McCain had somewhat revealing experience before he ran for office. He was a pilot in the so-called Vietnamese War and was taken captive by North Vietnam after his airplane was shot down. He spent several years as a prisoner of war prior to being released after the end of the war. The senator was not free to leave the prisoner of war camp. He was a slave of the Vietnamese. He was there involuntary. He had to do so as he was told. One can only presume that if anyone should understand the word slavery, involuntary and mandatory, it should be the senator, but for some reason he does not. It is ironic that both of these men had taken the same oath when they became senators. I do hereby swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I will take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of office on which I am about to enter to. So help me God. These two senators took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States when they became senators. If neither had taken the time to read the document in its entirety, they would have read the 13th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War. There are some historians who claim that the war was fought to end slavery. The amendment reads, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. If Senator McCain's bill makes all the American young people slaves of the government or requires involuntary servitude and all the slavery or involuntary servitude that is legal, it as a punishment for a crime, it follows that citizenship in America must be termed a crime, the punishment for which is involuntary servitude. So slavery becomes freedom, and freedom becomes slavery in the convoluted thinking of these two senators. Involuntary servitude becomes fair. Mandatory service becomes a responsibility of citizenship. America's founding fathers had no such problem with understanding the difference between the two words, freedom and slavery. They wrote this: we build these truths to be self evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A self evident truth is one that is not debatable. It is true simple because it is true. No one can say that a self evident truth is false because man's mind tells him that is true. Man cannot debate whether these rights belong to mankind because they are not debatable. These rights were deemed to be inalienable by those who wrote the Declaration. The word is defined as that which may be taken away or transferred. The Declaration went on to say that liberty was one of those inalienable rights. The word liberty is defined in the dictionary as freedom or release from slavery, imprisonment, captivity, or any other form of arbitrary control. Liberty is freedom, freedom from government, freedom from mandatory service, freedom from slavery of senators like McCain and Demetri. Many inalienable right to liberty is no longer a self-evident truth. Senators have now decided that liberty is mandatory service. Slavery is not fair. The New World Order is getting closer. Damn, and that is a fact. And I'm going to leave that right there. For some true like, share, subscribe. We're going to end that right there because I'm not reading that. Shoot, this